It's time for us to check back in with Dorie, Woman of the Mountains, and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, you can look in the description below. Now, in the part of the book that we left off, you'll remember her family was decided they had to leave Boogertown and they were going to go to the logging camps. So this part of the book that we're starting now, it spans the time between 1912 and 1917. When I was 13 in 1912, we packed our belongings and prepared to move into the high mountains. Uncle Dave and Aunt Rintha were not going now. Uncle Dave said he might join us later. So much of me would be left behind. My childhood was over. Never again would I have the freedom I had enjoyed here in this world of rounded hills and orchards. So much had happened in the last year. My bout with scarlet fever and catarrh of the stomach, changing schools, and Ma selling my baby lamb. Now I was going into the wilderness to face a life without schools or churches, Easter eggs, circuses, or friends. I picked up my doll and started down the road to Aunt Rintha's. Ma said I was too big to play with dolls, and besides, I wouldn't have time for it with all the chores to be done. I left my one and only doll on the porch of Aunt Rintha's cabin. Some of my cousins would have more time to play than I. Pa borrowed Uncle Jimmy Maple's open surrey for us to make the trip in more comfort. The surrey was open to the cold blast of frigid air, but at least we sat comfortable instead of being battered and bruised in a jolt wagon. Every obstacle in the road was magnified many times over when the wagon wheels bounced and slid over them. Men with two such wagons came for our household goods. Other men drove our cattle through Sugarlands to our new home in the fish camp prong above Elkmont. With the surrey leading the way, we started to the mountains on a cold January morning. We went through the glades, White Oak Flats, Fighting Creek, and on to Elkmont. Fighting Creek hills were steep. A light covering of snow and ice made the trail dangerous. The horses' feet slipped and the surrey's wheels went round and round without going anywhere. Pa said we'd have to get out and walk so the horse could pull the surrey over the mountain. So there we were, walking instead of going in style and comfort, while the horse and the beautiful surrey went in front of us. When Pa called for a rest stop, we were over the steepest part. Looking around, Ma saw an orchard of winter John apple trees. A few apples hung on the limbs like ornaments on a Christmas tree. Ma pulled one off and tasted it. It was frozen, but edible. We took as many as we could reach without having to go through snowdrifts left from the last storm. The temperature dropped as we went higher into the mountains. Snow was beginning to fall, covering the ground before us and making it hard to stay on the trail. Pa got out and walked beside the horse to keep him from stepping off the hard-packed trail into ditches and holes covered by the snow. Everything looked smooth and perfect ahead of us. Snow had the eerie quality of equalizing the dangerous and the good. Careful, short steps were necessary to keep us from wandering from the trail. Ma had bundled us up in our heaviest woolen coats and scarves. The only part of us visible were eyes looking through the cracks in the scarves wrapped around our faces. Steam swooshed from the horse's nose when he breathed. Late in the afternoon, I saw Elkmont for the first time. Rough buildings were everywhere. They looked all alike to me. Pa found Uncle Harrison Maple's house just before dark. Uncle Harrison was married to Nancy Jane Ogle and had 7 children, whom I'd never met. With so many relatives already in the camps, maybe I wouldn't be so lonely after all. After supper, there were 10 children to bed down, plus 4 adults. Most of us slept on pallets in front of the fireplace. Ma shook me awake in the morning darkness. The first train was leaving for fish camp soon. Pa had already been out loading our boxes on a flat car. The wagon road stopped here and only the railroad went further into the mountains. It would be our only link with the outside world. About 3 feet of new snow had fallen during the night. Pa walked in front of us, clearing a path through the drifting whiteness. We climbed into a boxcar and huddled together to keep warm. Heavy, snow-laden clouds dropped down over the mountains, shutting out the dawn. Soon the train stopped in front of a long bunkhouse building. It was high in front with the roof sloping several feet in the back and just a few yards off the railroad tracks. Inside was rough and bare and still smelled like fresh lumber. The cooking area was in the middle of the building. On both ends were rooms with built-in bunks. We would live in one end and the boarders in the other. Pa set up the stove and made a fire. All the barrels and boxes were stacked inside the door, and by nightfall everything was in place and we were safe and warm in our new home. Ma was baking cornbread and frying salt pork for supper. It would be 3 days before the boarders came. Lola and I helped get the house ready. We had to have enough quilts, pillows, and soft flannel blankets, those we used for sheets, for 8 bunks. The bunks were attached to the wall, one above the other, in twos. Ma's pillows were soft and plump with the down of many ducks and geese. I had seen her take down from them many times. Securing the bird in her lap, she'd hold its legs in one hand and run the other caressingly over the bird's breast. When it least suspected, she would withdraw a handful of down. Feathers from ducks and geese are used in pillows. Chicken feathers have a strong odor that never goes away, no matter how long the feathers are aired and dried. Ma kept her feathers in clean ticking until she had enough to make a plump, soft pillow. Ma made our food list and stocked the pantry. We hadn't been able to bring much food with us because the crops were so bad. Pa would take the list to the company store about a mile down the railroad. Everything was near the railroad. It was the lifeline connecting one camp to another and to the outside world. At the store, bacon was 10 cents a pound, white flour for biscuits was 50 cents for 50 pounds, and cornmeal was 50 cents a bushel. On the last weekend in January 1912, our boarders arrived. They were George Rayfield, Harrison Cardwell, Doc Schultz, Arthur Whaley, Richard Whaley, Frank Reinhardt, and 2 Germans from the Alleghenies. Some of them worked on the railroad with Pa, and some of them were loggers, moving the timber down the mountain to the railroad. The days were long and tiring. Ma and I got up before the sun to cook breakfast and pack lunches for Pa and the 8 men. Pa seldom had to wake them. The smell of Ma's good breakfast got them up. They loved Ma's cooking. She made several pans of cathead biscuits, platters of sausage or side meat, eggs, strong coffee, and jelly, honey, or molasses. Ma's biscuits were called catheads because they were big and round like a cat's head. Lunches were cornbread or biscuits, meat, fruit if we had it, and sometimes baked sweet potatoes. I hated having boarders. My days were spent in the house cleaning or washing dishes. I didn't cook because Ma didn't have the time or the patience to teach me. We washed clothes outside in a big black kettle. I couldn't go to bed at night until every dish was clean and the table set for tomorrow's breakfast. We didn't get a day off because the men worked 7 days a week. They cut and hauled timber 6 days and cut wood for the skidder on Sunday. There was no church or school for me to go to anyway. Ma's Aunt Rachel Carver's daughter, Martha, lived behind us in a small cabin. They kept one boarder, and Aunt Rachel helped cook at some of the other boarding houses. Martha soon became a good friend. When we weren't working, we played along the river and took long walks in the woods. On a crisp, sunny day in March, we were exploring in the woods and came upon the foundation of a log cabin from long ago. Deciding to practice our balancing act, we climbed up on the log frame. Carefully stepping around one of the corners, I lost my balance and fell backwards into the frame. Landing flat on my backside, I lay back on the cold ground and giggled at my predicament. Just as I tried to get up, something furry went over me and into the woods. Looking over my shoulder to see if it had any kin, I saw 3 tiny kittens huddled together in a sheltered corner. There had been nothing so beautiful and precious in my life since Pa gave me the lamb. We went over to see if they were wild, but they showed no fear of us. I wanted them all, but the white one with the orange spots was my favorite. Ma would never let me bring them home because they'd be a bother. Martha and I decided we would leave them where they were and take turns feeding them so neither her mother nor mine would be too suspicious of our activities. "I especially want the tiniest one with the orange spots," I said. "I'm going to name him Moonsie." Martha thought it was the strangest name she had ever heard. Ma had once had a cat named Moonsie. She'd never tell me where she ever heard of anyone or anything named that. She'd laugh and look mischievous. Now I had a Moonsie too. Ma loved being near the river. All our water for bathing and washing was carried from there. So many speckled trout clogged the stream that Ma brought up a pan full of small ones every time she filled the dishpan with water. She dipped them out with her hand and put them back in the river. After she put supper on to cook, she'd take her birch pole to the river. She almost always caught enough trout to feed the men for breakfast. Her bait was called stick bait, a small worm encased in a cocoon found in the water, or redworms. I didn't fish because I couldn't make myself bait my hook, and Ma wouldn't do it for me. The crystal cold water took the place of our spring house on the farm. Pa built a sturdy box which he lowered into the water. Milk and butter were sealed in buckets and stored in the cold. Cold water constantly ran over it, making the milk icy cold. Heavy green watermelons sank to the bottom of the stream. They stayed there overnight until we feasted on them after the sun started sinking and the boarders felt like having a party. It took 3 large melons to feed the hungry men. We only needed our river icebox in the warmer months. Nature provided us with an icebox as big as all outdoors from September to the 1st of May. Every week, new families were coming into fish camp. A school was necessary now. Company men were given time off from their logging duties to build a box-like building that would be used as a school and a church. Any denomination could use the building, but the Methodists had one Sunday out of every month set aside for them. The other denominations could use it when there was a free Sunday. Colonel Townsend, president of Little River Company, was a Methodist, and he did much to promote Methodism in the camp. Moonsie was growing every day and was my constant companion. Ma had allowed me to bring him home if I promised to keep him out of the house and out of her way. She didn't know he waited until the house was dark and came through an open window, finding my bunk and sleeping at my feet at night. He ran like lightning when he heard noise coming from Pa and Ma's direction. When school started, I left him to fend for himself and stay out of Ma's reach. Again, I was the oldest child in school. Letha McMahon was near my age, so we became friends. Letha and her family had moved into the house where Aunt Rachel and Martha lived. They had moved to another logging job to run a boarding house. Martha took the other 2 kittens with her. Her ma didn't mind having cats around. Miss Mattie Bohannon was our teacher. Her family lived at Fighting Creek and owned a store there. She stayed at our house during the week and went home on the weekends. She was young, pretty, and fun to be with. One weekend, she invited Letha and me to go home with her to Fighting Creek. We were nervous and excited. I had nothing pretty to wear, and Ma didn't have time to make a dress for me. Letha said I could borrow her yellow silk dress to wear to church on Sunday. She had 2 silk dresses because her family had been working with the lumber company longer than Pa, and her ma, having only 1 boarder to look after, had time to sew. Friday was the longest day we ever spent. When school was finally over, we all went to Ma's for our things. My clothes were neatly packed in a basket Ma had made of white oak splits. We rode the train to Elkmont, where Miss Mattie's brother met us with 2 white horses to ride down to Fighting Creek. The Bohannons lived in a white 2-story house. It was more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. All the furniture was bought. The surface was smooth and glossy and felt like glass or china when I touched it. White lace curtains hung at the windows, carpet covered the floors, and flowered wallpaper was in every room. The pictures on the walls had gold frames. I stood speechless and awed by the beauty of it all. The only other piece of bought furniture I could remember seeing was Miss Marshall's organ. How could Miss Mattie bear to leave this beautiful house and come to live in our rough, crudely made home? Her parents were very nice to us. They didn't tease or seem amused by our open-mouthed reaction to such gracious living. Besides the grocery store, they owned a farm and an orchard. They could afford anything they wanted. Miss Mattie didn't need the little money she got for teaching. She seemed to be concerned about the children in our school and wanted to help in any way she could to further our education and improve our self-images. We went to Gatlinburg, formerly White Oak Flats, on Saturday night. There were a few stores, the Mountain View Hotel at the other end of town, and of course a church. Sunday morning I put on Letha's yellow dress, brushed and braided my hair, and we all went to church. The preacher's words drifted over my head and out the open windows. Faces around me were all looking straight ahead to the pulpit. The benches were worn and smooth from long and constant service. How many Sundays and how many people had been there before me? My hands gently touched the soft silken folds of the yellow dress which reached my shoe tops. Ma had a silk dress for her Sunday best, but I had never needed one before. I was almost a young lady, and I wanted beautiful, soft dress of my own. Yes, I'd ask Ma for one when I got home, I thought. Lola and I had a favorite story we loved for Ma to tell. A mountain girl had a handsome beau. Her pa would let the young man come to see her once a week. The poor girl only had one dress, and she hated for him to always see her in it. She and her ma decided they'd pretend she had more dresses. Every time the young man came and knocked at the door, the girl would call out to her ma in a loud voice, "Ma, which dress should I wear, the new one or the blue one or the one you made last?" The ma would answer, "Wear your blue one because it matches your eyes." Of course, the blue dress was the only one she had. After a big Sunday dinner at the Bohannons, Miss Mattie's brother brought the horses into the yard and helped us climb into the saddles. He would go back to Elkmont with us and wait until we were all on the train going back to fish camp. Oh, there was so much to tell Ma and Pa when I got home. Miss Mattie's parents, her home, and her sweetness were lovely memories to be tucked away and treasured. That night, in the cool darkness, stroking Moonsie's soft fur, I dreamed of silk dresses. By 1910, before we moved to fish camp, the Smokies were covered with logging camps and a network of railroads. There were 10 lumber companies from Chilliwack, Tennessee to Waterville, North Carolina. Little River Company was the largest company on the Tennessee side of the mountains. Champion Fiber Company was the largest of all the companies, reaching from Waterville on the North Carolina side to the Tennessee foothills near Greenbrier. Besides Champion, there were 6 smaller companies on the North Carolina side. They were Suncrest, Parsons, Norwood, Ritter, Montvale, and Kitchen. The Chilliwack Extract Company owned several thousand acres above Pittman Center and Cosby. On the other end, near Chilliwack, the Aluminum Company of America owned many acres. They didn't cut the timber, but were interested in the water for dams to provide energy for an industrial plant to be built in the future. People came from all the states to find work here. Lone men came begging for places to stay. Every family who had a spare bed kept boarders. We heard rumors about the strange customs of foreigners in the camp. Ma said Italians living near Greenbrier hung their chickens outside to ripen a day or two before they ate them. Some of our native habits must have seemed just as strange to Italians. About this time, the W.T. Cope family of Avery County, North Carolina, started working for the Suncrest Lumber Company. Mr. Cope was the bookkeeper, and his teenage son worked as a logger. Mr. Cope was well educated according to the standards in Western North Carolina at that time. William Theodore was the youngest son of John Alexander Cope and Elizabeth Short. The oldest son was Brady. The story of W.T. and Brady reminds me of the biblical story of Esau and Jacob. Brady was his father's favorite. They worked in the fields and hunted together. W.T. stayed close to his mother. She decided that he would have an education at any cost. She sold eggs, chickens, goats, and any surplus goods from the farm to get enough money for teachers. So instead of working in the fields, W.T. stayed inside and studied. He became a bookkeeper and a calligrapher. When no bookkeeping job was available, he traveled throughout the state teaching penmanship in the beautiful Old English script. He copied official state documents in Old English. These historic documents are still probably in the archives in Raleigh. He married Margaret Alice Key. They were family tree conscious. They had traced their ancestors back to 17th century England. Mr. Cope and his son Fred came to work for the Little River Company in 1912 and lived near Elkmont. We lived within 4 miles of each other, but didn't meet until several years later. Mr. Cope was the company bookkeeper until he grew tired of the mountains and moved to Knoxville to work for Standard Knitting Mills. They lived on Elucid Avenue in the mill houses. Fred, their oldest son, had become a mountaineer at heart. He had worked since he was 12 years old. The opportunity his father had had for an education was not extended to him. There were 10 children in the family, and his money was needed to help support them. In a yellowed old notebook, he wrote about his early life. I quote, "Looking back to the days of childhood, I wish to mention some of the things that happened, some of which I am very sorry for. At the age of 5, I caught my first fish, which was very exciting at the time. At the age of 6, I began selling newspapers. I had to give it up because I climbed upon the yard fence and jumped to the ground, striking a large glass jar with my left foot, cutting it half off across the center. I couldn't walk on it for weeks. At the age of 10, I was cutting stove wood for our cook stove when I stuck the axe through my left hand, losing the use of one finger for the remainder of my life. At the age of 11, I did something I have regretted ever since. I owned a mother hen and a bunch of baby chicks. I also owned a little dog. I fed my dog its lunch, and it carried the food toward my neighbor's little store and buried it in the ground. It stayed close by to guard the food. The mother hen and her babies went walking by. My dog caught the hen and gave her a rough time for a few seconds. The merchant saw what happened, picked up a good-sized stone, and cast it at my dog. The rock hit her on top of the head, and she fell over dead. My father owned a shotgun, and my mother thought she had hid it from me. I ran into the house, pulled the gun from under the bed mattress, loaded it, and ran back into the yard. Tears blinded me, but I could see the merchant standing in the store door between large glass windows on each side of him. I placed the gun to my shoulder and fired. The force of the blast sent me spinning and finally landing hard on my backside. When I sat up and cleared my head, I could see that both windows were shattered and the merchant was coming toward me like a mad bull. Blood was oozing from 2 tiny holes in his face. One buckshot had hit him on the cheek and another on his nose. He grabbed me by the back of my shirt and carried me like a sack of potatoes dangling from one big hand. Ma was already coming to see what the noise was about. The merchant dropped me at her feet and told her if she didn't take care of me, he would. Ma picked up a piece of stove wood and started thrashing me. At 12 years of age, I got a job as a water boy for a railroad construction crew. I began to learn how to use different tools. First was a switch-handle hammer drive steel to drill holes in rock so it could be dynamited, a double-bladed axe to chop with, a cross-cut saw to cut down trees and cut them into logs, a peavey to roll the logs. I learned how to drive oxen to pull the logs and cross ties. We pulled logs from the woods to the sawmills where they were sawed into lumber. I quit being a water boy and started working with the team when the boss thought I was ready. I was driving a yoke of oxen, hauling lumber to the railroad to be shipped away. We didn't have check lines on our cattle to guide them. When we wanted them to bear to the right, we would say, "Gee," or to the left, "Haw," or to stop, we would say, "Whoa." I was standing on a wagon loaded with lumber, moving it a mile down to the railroad. I had to go down a very sloping grade that went into a river. The road had been cleared through the forest and was narrow and rough. I was standing with my feet braced, my chest against the brake. The brake was the body of a small tree cut about 6 foot long. The lower end fastened into the brake beam. My brake pole broke, and I pitched forward, landing with my back against a tree. The wagon wheel rolled against my chest and stomach. There I was, between the wheel and the tree, and couldn't get half a breath. No one was near. I thought fast and breathed a little. The oxen were very good to mind and do what was said to them. I spoke just as gently as I could. "Back up, boys, back up." They lifted their heads high and braced their front feet, giving a surge backwards. The wagon moved enough for me to scramble free. I petted both their broad heads. "Thank you, Lord, and thank you, Buck and Barry. They had saved my life." Shortly after this, the crew brought in horses to replace the oxen. I helped train a beautiful team for logging. They were almost perfect in a few weeks. The teamsters wouldn't let me work the horses. I was told to build a dam near the logging trail so a flow of water could be turned down it, making the ground slippery and easier to move the logs. When the dam was finished, it was about 5 feet deep. So I worked the water flow while my beautiful team of horses pulled logs. One day the teamster came with a trail of 9 logs, one behind the other. He stopped the team for a rest and talked to me. When he started to go, the team fell into my dam. Their heads and bodies, up to their rumps, were underwater. They were hanging there with their long trail still on the path. They couldn't get out of the harnesses. The teamster started yelling for help and went running back up the mountain. I jumped into the water, lifted one nose up with my left hand so it could breathe, and ran my right hand into my pants pocket. I pulled out my knife and opened it with my right hand and teeth. I cut the hamstring and belly band to release the horse from the harness. It leaped up out of the water. I released the other one the same way. I patched the harnesses with wire and had it back on them by the time the driver came back. The teamster didn't seem too happy that I'd freed the team. The other loggers teased him about leaving a boy to do a man's job. There's another place in my memory I would like to mention here. It may sound strange and foolish to everyone else. During the years in the woods when the weather would be too cold or rainy to work, I would spend these days by myself under a large shelving rock projecting out of the mountainside. I would go there alone, regardless of how bad the weather was. The rough, rowdy men made my life miserable if I stayed in the bunkhouse. They seemed to outdo each other in telling dirty stories, drinking, and cussing. Out under my rock, I could be alone to think my own thoughts and dream my own dreams. I built a big fire and spent my days planning for my future. And education was out of the question. My father came for my paychecks to help support the family. There would never be enough to go to school. So my desire now was to become a locomotive engineer. I selected my future companion here too. I knew the color of her hair, her eyes, and her size. She would be sweet and shy. Just another great glimpse into Dorie's life. The beginning of the part where she's describing them leaving in the snow, I really enjoyed that part. I can't imagine traveling, and they thought they was going to be traveling in style, and then they had to get off and walk because it was so slick and so snowy. I love the part about them picking the apples off the apple trees there, even though it was winter, and being able to eat them. Makes me wish I knew I could taste that apple. John's winter apple, I think she called it. I really liked that part. The sad part, of course, is that Dorie says her childhood was over. From then on, it was work, that she had to work. She had to help her mother. And I can't imagine how tough it was to take care of 8 boarders, 8 people that you're feeding, and also washing their clothes and just cleaning up after them and all that. That would be a tough job. Once they're there in their new home with the boarders, I love the description of them building the spring, instead of having a spring house, that they put their spring box in the river because it was cold. And I especially love the part of her mother dipping up. Every time she would dip up a dishpan of water, she would get fish in it. I would love to have seen that, if fish were that so prolific that she could just literally, get up a dishpan full every time she went to get water. And being near the river, when the part, again, about talking about fishing, I love the little description of stick bait. If you've never seen that, maybe you have, you're like me, you grew up with it, but I'll have to find some. There's plenty of stick bait down in Stamy Creek, so I'll have to find a piece to show you, and it really does look like a stick until you break it open. So I really enjoyed that little part. probably my favorite part of this part of the book, and it's kind of a theme throughout the book, so I've enjoyed it all the way from the beginning, but it's just the ingenuity, the self-sufficiency of Dorie's father had it too, but especially Dorie's mother. She could just do anything, that woman could. She could figure out how to do anything, and just her know-how. She is kind of gruff and rough around the edges compared to Dorie, but she could just figure out how to take care of anything that needed to be done. Man, I wish I had her knowledge. But also with this book, at this part of the book, at the end, we kind of get introduced to Fred. Now, Fred is going to be Dorie's husband. Fred and Dorie hadn't met yet, but this is kind of our first little introduction to him. And man, what a hard time he had. All those injuries and all that, but then what ingenuity. You can tell he's such a learner. That he wants to learn, and also a dreamer. I love the part of him saying his favorite place to go was out under that rock. So he didn't want to stay with the men who were rowdy, and of course he went out there where he could think and dream and think about his future. I just really admire, though, the ingenuity of him in that. I mean, I would have just panicked if the horses had jumped in there, but he kept his head and he knew how to save them. And you can just see even all the descriptions of the ways that he was getting hurt. And even the horror of him shooting at the merchant. Thank goodness he didn't hit him. But even that was a great learning lesson for him. I'm sure that he learned the rest of his life not to let his temper and his anger get away from him like that. But that ingenuity and self-sufficiency that you can just see throughout Dorie's family. And you can kind of get a peek that it's about to come, that is to come with Fred too. And Dorie, how could you be around her mother and not pick up some of the stuff? So I'm sure Dorie was very self-sufficient too, and very knowing about a lot of things. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope that you'll leave me a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back in next Friday, because we've got to find out what happens next to Dorie in Woman of the Mountains.